I think, what was I gonna say?
Like my question was, let me backtrack.
Liberation of Asia.
Yes.
Liberation of Asia.
Thank you.
This is what happens
Yes.
when we do it at night.
I was like, oh, too many things happening.
Hello and welcome to The Wedge. I'm your host, Dr. Joyce Del Rosario. This videocast highlights Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders working towards social justice. We call it The Wedge because Asian Americans are often wedged in the black and white binary conversations on race. We are tossed around as either model minorities or the perpetual foreigners who have the Kung flu. But really, API folks are positioned to help break the binary conversations to move us toward justice and equity for all people. The Wedge introduces Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are doing great things in their community. In this first season, we will focus on API pastors, practitioners, and academics who have invested themselves in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I hope you enjoy this series.
My name is Janna Loui. I am an ordained American Baptist minister serving in the Southern California area. I am second generation Hong Kong American. I just had a conversation about that, and I'm saying Hong Kong American because Asian American is a political term. So Hong Kong American it is, even though it's a little bit maybe what people might not be used to it, I should say. So second generation, I grew up in the Chicagoland area and also spent quite a bit of time down south. So that's a little bit about me.
What's South? South. You're in SoCal right now, so South.
The real South.
The real
Nashville
South.
and Atlanta.
Okay, thank you. And Em, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I cannot introduce my name. I was born and raised in a country in Asia, and I would love to return to my country. So that's why I hide my identity. But I'm really happy to be here. I'm currently an associate pastor of a church in LA. And my church is partnering with a nonprofit organization that is doing organizing work. So I am a community organizer as well.
Great. That was a perfect introduction of who you are and what you do. Well, I asked you both in particular for this episode because I wanted to get a more global perspective of Black Lives Matter. We did focus and have focused on Asian Americans specifically, and the work that they do in solidarity with the African American community. But I think there's something to be said that this has been a global movement. George Floyd, the shelter in and COVID-19, somehow it captured people in a new way, even though we've had these, killings over and over and over again. But it captured the thoughts and the prayers and the gatherings and the protests of the world. And both of you have experience in Asian countries as well as the United States. And I wanted to have you share about the global perspective as well as your work. Both of you do work in the US around solidarity. And so I wanted to share, I wanted you to kind of talk on that. But, here's my first question. And actually, Em, I'm going to pick at you a little bit here. Being first generation, born in a different Asian country, and then coming to the US, it's not typical that we would see, a first generation Asian be a community organizer the way that you have been. What is it why does racial justice matter to you? Why does community organizing matter to you?
I did not know community organizer was a thing until I went to seminary and took a class and learned about it. But I would say that my home context growing up in a communist country and understanding the history of my country, my current communist government comes from a union of low-wage workers and farmers that were dissatisfied and oppressed by their current government at the time. So they organized and built up enough power to fight against that oppressive system and overthrow that oppressive government. And that's how they become the new government today. And with that, I see the value of community organizing, and see how my people history has always been a history of resistance and trying to fight for liberation. And interestingly, the new communist government becomes like the abused now become the abuser to the people, right? Because they don't allow anyone else to organize, even though they organize to win for liberation. And when they came into power, the mantra of the new government was, and my parents always talk about it, and it's everywhere in my country, is that this government is for the people and because of the people. But that was not my experience growing up, and it was not the reality for my people in my home context. And so I think when I started learning about community organizing here, like my first question was, I see the parallel, like these low wage workers, these disadvantaged community members, I want to build power that will create a beloved community that we all long for. And I think I'm convinced that there's no societal change without community organizing. And so that's why I'm drawn to this work, because of my upbringing in my Asian country, and also seeing the power of community organizing here as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's powerful. It's powerful. I mean, because of the context and because of the circumstance, that's one reason why we needed to keep your identity safe. And yet it's also the same thing that motivates you to keep doing the work here. And even for other communities, different from your own and different from the one that you grew up with. And it's just powerful how that thread just continues in your life. Janna, tell us how did racial justice matter to you? Or tell us a little more about what you do, and then kind of how you bring in some racial justice issues from there.
I think one of the things I care a lot about is for Asian Americans and for liberation for Asian Americans. In terms of racial justice, I think in many ways, what probably moved me on the journey was receiving a fellowship when I graduated from seminary, where I studied socio-political engagement through preaching in context without religious liberty. So that's how I ended up kind of doing more studies in Asia. And some of it is because actually at that point, there was a lot of anger within me with what was happening in our country, and realizing race and racial realities are kind of what this country has been founded on. I mean, it was founded on like free labor and all of that. And so without dealing with that, you can kind of study the small, like interpersonal, personal, individual thing that kind of doesn't mean anything. Or we can really take seriously that our faith actually engages the world around us. And so race, I think, doesn't actually really easily translate to other contexts, because I think people end up seeing it as just like skin tones. But I think it translates well to think about socio-political engagement. And I would say as a second generation person, it does matter, because I think a lot of immigration are because of geopolitical realities. And so I would say that it means that it's in every part of our lives, whether or not we want it to be. So I'm not sure if it's a choice to engage as much as it is, I think, part of what it means to be faithful, at least. I think for Asian Americans, one of the things that I feel like I've had to learn is some of the racial conversations in the US are so centered on domestic realities. And yet as Asian Americans, I don't know if we have a choice to just make it domestic, because it means, because without kind of understanding the geopolitical realities that kind of, in some sense, moved my people, our people, it's hard to kind of have a holistic picture. And I think we end up being swept into kind of a very US mentality, like, oh, what we see is everything that's there.
I almost never hear about that, right? As Asian Americans, many of us are naturally transmigrational people. We are naturally diasporic people. You're right, our realities aren't just domestic. The black-white binary, though, will always make it just domestic, because in the black-white binary, it's only about America. But for those of us who have family and who have come from other countries, you're right. It's not just a domestic issue. It is larger. Em, how I would love to hear, like, can you respond to Janna and like how that has connected to you, or is that something that you experience as well?
Yeah, like you mean liberation of?
Yeah, the liberation of Asians, and I mean, you experienced something like that in your country, and then as well as coming over here and wanting to find liberation for African Americans here in the U.S. But yeah, I don't know if you had any different thoughts to add on, or anything else you wanted to share about what Janna just said.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like when I grew up, one of my friends said, "I wish that the U.S. won the war so that we don't have to learn English." And English is power, right? It gives you access to education, to employment, and to, a better life. And it stuck with me, right? That is the mentality that most young people in big cities have, because of the white supremacy in the US, like militarism, and that have influenced my home context. So even until now, that is something that is still shaping our imagination of liberation. We think that like the more westernized we are, like the better future we may have. And I think like the more I do the work of like understanding like my history, and especially living in the US, like I'm just being more aware of my own story and how different I am, right? And so like you have to learn your history more. And I think appreciate more of the history of my people always fighting and pushing against imperialism and fighting for liberation. And just because our current communist government doesn't embody the liberation that they fought for and they long for, that doesn't mean that we cannot continue to create the beloved community that we want. And so I think it's definitely I hear like what Janna said, because even I think like my community, like the refugee community, right, living here, being impacted by white supremacy and continue being impacted. A lot of my community members are at risk of deportation and don't have access to housing and employment because of the language barriers, right? So I think the liberation of API is so important, because it impacts how we live and how we are in our context.
Yeah, they're connected, right? Our liberation, Black liberation, Latinx liberation is all connected with each other. We actually need each other in that way. Part of why we're doing this, podcast, this video cast is because I wanted to share, like, we're here, we're trying to do this together. And not everyone can recognize that. Both of you mentioned this, and I think it's kind of going a little off topic, but not. How do you define liberation? Because what Em had said was, they wish that the U.S. would have won, which is interesting, right? Because in the Philippines, the U.S. did win, and we became the Little Brown Brothers, and all that fun stuff in my personal history. And it's and I hear different things from different Filipinos. From certain Filipinos, that was a gift from God, and it allowed us to do different things, and it gave a different type of liberation. Including language, English, the ability to come here, being able to serve in the military, etc. So for some, that is the American dream is liberation. For you, I would love to hear what both of your thoughts are on what does liberation look like.
One of the things that I really felt like I had to learn, especially as a US person, is that liberation isn't necessarily about reaching or attaining some ideal. Because ideals will be different and will look different depending on your social location and where you are. I think the other thing that often, especially countries who have a much longer history than the US, we're kind of like teenagers, right? We've only been around like 400 years or so, which is like a blip for many other countries and cultures, right? Especially, I would say, our motherlands.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, but we act like we're all developed and stuff. And so in many ways, I feel like cultures and countries with a longer history or longer sense of history understand how power dynamics work. That when one empire falls, another one rises up and takes its place. And so I think what I've learned is there's always a sense of like maybe tangible outcomes we might hope for, but there's still kind of a longer picture of history and reality. So our liberation, in some sense, I would say, liberation has to be much longer than even what we see right now. I think in some sense, I would say, therefore seeking shalom and wholeness, restoration of things that are broken. And those pieces of kind of, what we see as, I would say, a very clear arc in scripture is part of, or is how I would define liberation. The question of what is liberation also feels in some sense odd, because it depends on where you are in relation to power. So I think Dr. Love Seacrest preached, she gave one last lecture in one of the last lecture series at Fuller, and talked about if you're on the underside of the empire or if you're on the side of the empire, right? And I think part of what I've learned even in some studies with South African apartheid, where the church was on both sides of that, our ability to locate appropriately where we are in some sense in relation to power really matters in terms of how we ask that question, what that means.
Oh man, I could talk with you for hours and hours and days, right? Because that just tailspins me into the idea of proximity to power. Well, that's the whole problem of the model minority myth, right? It dupes us into thinking that we have closer proximity to power and that we actually can attain that power, and we can actually become white in some ways. And it dupes, our African-American friends or Latinx friends to thinking that we have closer proximity to power. And so, however, how you locate it and how people see where you're located in it, that is the absolute problem with the model minority myth.
Yeah, no, I resonate with what Janna shared. And I was thinking of a campaign that the organization that I'm partnering with, when they were fighting alongside with LAX airport workers for fair wages and for benefits, as employees there. And they were fighting for years for dignity and respect, right, in the workplace. And then one day, like the attorney that has been fighting with them, she received the news that morning that the LAX airport will not negotiate with them anymore because now there are Uber and Lyft drivers. And so they don't need like airport taxi drivers anymore. And so she was feeling very sad and didn't know how to share that news with the people that she's been organizing with, and know that they have sacrificing themselves and put themselves on the line to speak up against the management team. Some people have been retaliated because they spoke up. And so, but she had to share that news. And so she like gathered everyone and she shared that news and she said, I'm really sorry that we lost.
Mm.
And the taxi drivers just told her, no, we didn't lose, because now we have become different people after years of organizing. We don't see ourselves as people without power anymore. Now we know that we have a lot of power and we can do anything. So next, when the next opportunity rises up, we know that we can do it and we can continue to fight for our liberation and our community and our children's liberation. So I think that really stuck with me when I do organizing, because most of the time we're so focusing on winning campaigns and winning policies that will be beneficial to our community. But at the end of the day, it's not about winning or losing. It's about transformation of the community. And I think that's liberation.
And Em, I don't know if I can mention this, so you can let me know. You attend a predominantly African American church, yes?
Yes.
So you worship in predominantly Black spaces. You work with, I'm guessing, a variety of folks, as LA. Community organizing in LA means a lot of people. What does that mean for you, being Asian, being an Asian woman in that space? Like, how do you see your location? Maybe some of the pitfalls or maybe some of the power that you have as an Asian woman in those spaces.
Yeah, having a Black community that embraced me so much as a foreigner in this country,
Mm-hmm.
And how they make me feel like the most at home among all of the faith communities and congregations that I have visited. Like Asian American churches. I have visited like many different churches, but yeah, I would say that like the hospitality and of course, my faith community doesn't understand my history specifically, but just the way that they love me into their community has been such a gift. And that has allowed me to learn more about myself and to learn more about like community and what it means to live in interdependent relationships. And that has, that has been such a gift for me living in LA. I would say that, most of the time during the week, I feel like a foreigner. And when I go to my church, and I'm like the only Asian, no one looks like me, but then I will feel most at home, because of how I feel like my community is so honest about the racial and power dynamics and what's going on in society, that gives me space to talk about, like, my frustration or my anger and my rage. And that connects me more with myself, with others, and with God. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. Janna, here, also, if I can go there, I don't know if I can go there, but you helped host a webinar on abolishing the police. How did that go? What was the reaction? How was that for you particularly? I don't know if it had anything to do with you being an Asian American woman, but what was the reaction or feedback from doing that kind of a webinar?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, I would say it just it just seemed like it was important and kind of what needs to happen. I think in many ways, my philosophy of ministry is making sure this also was a gift from being under leaders in Asia, but learning that being faithful means discerning what God is doing in our present times and our present context. And so I think in many ways, through pandemic, there was a reality that there's a need to reimagine systems because it's so broken. I mean, the brokenness of our systems are so obvious right now. Right, especially in the US. I think you see it around the world, but one of my colleagues around the world, who's more senior, says, if it really didn't hit countries like the US or in Europe, would people really care? And that dynamic is already there, right? But now that it's within the US, I think we already see a lot of the ways that our system is really broken. And it's a little bit, I think, more obvious to everyone. But I think when, especially with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many others, it was the sense that this is just the conversation that we need to have to be faithful. So the need to understand the conversation, because I think especially the past 4 years in the US, there's a lot of ways that our political reality has made it such that I think we don't even do the work, especially people of faith. It seems we don't often do the work to even figure out what the conversation is. I also remember talking to activists on the ground in Ferguson about how they didn't expect the church to be there. And so in many ways, we can't expect to be leading any conversations. I don't think we need to be leading anything. If anything, I think we need to lean in and listen and learn. So in some sense, I think I was talking with a friend, dear friend of mine, and we just were on the phone. We're like, let's just do this for our communities, for the Black community, for the Asian community, for our communities. And we're not interested in talking to people who are just finding out that Black Lives Matter is a thing. This is for people who really want to understand what's happening and the systems at play. And so it was really just to understand the conversation on abolition, and then also to think about how this conversation of abolition interrogates our theological assumptions and how these questions actually should be prodding us towards faithfulness. Are there theological assumptions that kind of hinder us from engaging this conversation? And then also, what are the contributions and the gifts of this conversation to our faith? And I think it's more dialogical than anything. I don't think it's just one direction.
Yeah. Let me wrap it up this way. I want to kind of do a little summary of what I've heard both of you say. And actually, there's one more point that I did want us to talk about. The things that I've heard from both of you is that the liberation of Asians, the liberation of Asian Americans, whether in other countries or here in the US, it's tied to the liberation of Black people. It's tied to the liberation of Latinx, the liberation of others. We need to be liberated ourselves in order so that we could see that for others. One other theme that I noted from the both of you was you both mentioned rage. And I think that's for the stereotypes of an Asian American woman, rage is not usually one of the ones that you hear. And yet I've been doing a cohort with Asian American women with Erna Hackett, and we've talked about rage, and there's a lot of rage in this work, whether it's when you're just awakening to your own colonization, or rage as you're trying to deal with the oppressive systems. But I think maybe here's my question. How does rage inform you, and how does rage fuel you? So it's not necessarily a bad, I'm not valuing it as a bad thing. I'm actually valuing it as a good thing. But I'd love to hear both of you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm still working through rage. And there's a lot of rage like rising up in me. The more I'm in touch with myself and the history of my people. And I realized that rage informs me of the pain and the trauma and the violence that my community, my ancestors have experienced for so long. And perhaps it's not only just my rage, but like when I could express rage or could feel rage, I think I'm embodying that and expressing that for my people that maybe a lot of times as Asian women in my country, we couldn't do that. We didn't have space. We still don't have space to do that.
Yeah.
It makes me more aware and be more compassionate to myself and my people. I think because the tendency that I see, at least in my community, is that we're very critical of ourselves, but we are very gracious to white people. Yeah, to be honest. So I think that really informs me, yeah, of what we have experienced, and that, and I think like with my work in organizing is a venue for me to channel all of my rage in productive ways, to create something beautiful, something that I dream for. Yeah, and like do it with people who experience a lot of rage as well because of the oppression that they experience. And like that collective rage, I see that it has so much power to give us deeper imagination for what could be.
Oh,
Can
go
I
ahead.
say one thing?
Yes, you can.
Yes.
I don't know if I agree that like Asian American women don't usually have anger. Like I feel like it's a very familiar thing, and maybe one thing I would say is I think anger and deep sadness. I know Racial Melancholy, that's like a book that people have been reading and engaging with, but I think anger and sadness are sort of like two sides of one coin.
Yeah.
And even, you know, I think of in Cantonese that phrase of like swallowing suffering or eating bitterness, I think is all a part of this like dealing with our anger and our sadness, you know. And I don't know how we as a people who, whether it's coming as refugees or immigrants, don't carry that, you know. So I think I would disagree with that. I think if we look at it through a white lens, sure, maybe we don't. But I would say I'm very familiar with seeing anger, and very familiar with seeing sadness expressed in many different ways, from our food to our conversations to our silence.
Yeah.
So
we're taught though, as Asian American women, to not express it. We're taught to keep.
Or maybe our rage usually is not validated.
Or that's also happened.
Yeah, and affirmed as strength and power.
I've been mocked for it. I remember when I used to work for a large white organization, I would get introduced to other Asians as, oh, angry Asian woman, here's an angry Asian man. I thought you should meet each other. And this was by another Asian introducing us. So I was known for the anger, and I think that's really interesting that was sort of mocked that way.
Yeah, well, I think in some sense, I don't know about the, like, I think maybe as Asian Americans, I feel like we've had to piece it together, because I think even the whole anger thing, sometimes I just am really annoyed with Western psychology, because I feel like these like ways of seeing things are in these categories that really just don't make sense for us, you know. And so sure, if we use somebody else's grid, but if I don't, then I'm like, that question doesn't make sense to me, you know. Because I think you're right. It's either the way I think US society is socialized to see us. It's either we're, you know, not this, or we're dragon lady, right? Like, and then all of a sudden that is what we're like, they're so-called taught to see within us, right? So then we get that piece where people are like, oh, here's the angry Asian lady talking to. So I think I'm just like, well, sure, if we center like this lens, but I that's hard to do, I think, if we really take our, like, who we are as embodied people seriously, and not just who we are, but I would say who our families are, and and the stories and our communities that we carry.
Last words, last thoughts. This is the part where I don't know where I got that accent. This is the part where I typically would ask, what would you like to say to other Asian Americans about being in the Black-White binary?
I mean, I think I don't necessarily think of myself as being in the Black-White binary, you know? So I think when I saw the wedge question, I'm like, are you talking about a cheese wedge? Like, what are you, because I'm not a wedge, so I don't really think about it. I mean, however, I would say I'm deeply grateful for many from the Black community who have taught me. So I would say, even as a young minister, the people who have shaped me and continue to are deeply informed by the Black church and Black theology. And I think even in my own exploration or studies in seminary, often because that was a context that I had really learned from, it actually ended up being a lot of our Black women professors in seminary who really kind of made my seminary experience. And then, you know, in terms of like research and thinking, That was one comparative like piece that helped me in kind of understanding. So I don't know if I've ever seen myself in the black-white binary as much as the black-white binary is put on us. But I think if I see it as, I think we all are fighting against white supremacy, and maybe not even just that, but the ways in which empire is forcing itself on us in political, economic realities that end up coming out in racial realities in the US, right? So I think I see it more as that. And I think what I would say to Asian Americans is to take seriously our stories and knowing who we are. Because I think without kind of like engaging in that, I think, you know, to your question earlier about anger, I was very angry, especially before I went. And one of my professors in seminary actually, before the fellowship, said, Janna, make sure you spend time with older people. So I spent time with older people in Asia who were like, you know, who helped me kind of not like tamper down. They're like, yes, be angry. But it was sort of like, but there's a way in which faithfulness, we're still invited into, part of God's work. And somehow God has not abandoned God's people. And that includes my people, who I am. And that means that even if I'm not accepted or seen in both sides of the ocean, there's something whole about that we're still invited into. And so, yeah, I think as we learn more and really embrace our stories, I think there's more healing and less judgment on ourselves. But I think what I pray for in terms of liberation, one of the first things I pray for is that we would be rid of our self-hatred. I think that's part of the fragmentation that has been placed on us, that I long for us to kind of see how I think Asian Americans are incredibly creative. I think they're amazing. And I think I wish we knew that, and I wish we kind of lived in that reality.
Amen. Thanks, Janna. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I think I'm just savoring those words. It's so beautiful. What would I say? I think in community organizing spaces, I often find myself to be one of a few Asian or API members, and yeah, and sometimes it feels really lonely, and it feels like, yeah, I was invisible in that space because we are advocating for the Black and Brown community, and we're doing so much work in solidarity with our sisters and brothers, but no one asking about us. No one actually know our story. And so I think, like, for me, I would echo with what Janna shared, that like people would benefit from knowing our stories. And that is the gift that we bring to the movement and this moment that we live in.
Yeah, so good. So good. Thank you both. There's so many gems that both of you dropped that I'm like, I need to go back and listen to this all over again, because you have so much wisdom, both of you, and so much to offer. And I'm so glad for the work that you do and the ways in which you do them, and the willingness to be in those lonely spaces, even, as Em said, for the sake of the work, for the sake of the liberation of ourselves, for our people, and for others. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.